I'm Alex Hayes. I'm 29 years old, and my own brother locked me out of my family home and told me I didn't have a family anymore. Before I tell you how a single, urgent email from his lawyer changed absolutely everything, let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. It's always cool to see how far these stories travel. Alright, so picture this. It was a Tuesday afternoon in Asheville. The sky was that perfect shade of Carolina blue, and for the first time in months, I actually felt a flicker of hope. I just walked out of a job interview at a small but respected fashion design firm in Charlotte. The hiring manager, a sharp woman named Jessica Lynn, had looked at my portfolio, my actual designs, the things I poured my soul into, and she hadn't scoffed. She'd nodded slowly, a small smile playing on her lips. "You have a fresh perspective, Alex," she'd said. "There's passion here. We'll be in touch." Passion. It was a word I hadn't heard associated with my name in a long, long time. The whole drive home I felt lighter. I was rehearsing a speech in my head, a calm, reasonable conversation I was going to have with my family, mostly with my older brother, Nathan. "Look, I'm trying," I practiced saying to the windshield. "I know things have been tough, but I'm getting back on my feet. I just need a little time." I thought maybe, just maybe, we could find some common ground. I pulled into the familiar driveway of the two-story colonial I'd grown up in. The late afternoon sun glinted off the windows of my childhood bedroom. It looked peaceful, normal, too normal. I grabbed my keys, walked up the stone path to the heavy oak door, and slid my key into the lock. It didn't turn. I jiggled it. Nothing. A cold knot started to form in my stomach. I walked around to the side door by the garage, the one we always used. Same thing. The key went in, but the lock wouldn't budge. My heart started hammering against my ribs. I tried the back door, my last hope. Click. Stuck. Every single lock had been changed. My hands were trembling as I pulled out my phone to call Nathan. Straight to voicemail. My mom, Margaret. Voicemail. My dad, Robert. Voicemail. Panic was starting to bubble up in my chest, hot and sharp. And then my phone buzzed with a new text message. It was from Nathan. My thumb hovered over the notification before I finally pressed it. The words on the screen felt like a physical blow. "You're not part of this family anymore. Don't come back. Your stuff is boxed up. Pick it up Saturday at 5 p.m. We won't be here." I stood there, staring at the locked door, the useless key still in my hand. I was homeless. My own brother, my own family, had thrown me out without even having the decency to say it to my face. I spent that night and the next in a grimy motel off the highway, the kind of place where you don't take your shoes off. On the second day, broke and running on fumes, I was scrolling through my email on the motel's spotty Wi-Fi, looking for any scrap of good news. That's when I saw it. An email from a sender I didn't recognize, Walsh and Foster Law Firm. The subject line made my blood run cold. It read, "Urgent notification regarding breach of terms of the Clara Hayes Family Trust." I froze. Clara Hayes was my grandmother, and I was sure, absolutely positive, that this was Nathan's next move, using lawyers to make sure I never came back. To understand why that email sent a bolt of pure terror through me, you have to understand the landscape of my life. You have to understand that in the Hayes family, there were two currencies: real estate and adoration for my older brother, Nathan. I was bankrupt in both. My parents, Margaret and Robert, were Hayes Realty. They were pillars of the Asheville business community, sharp, respected, and utterly focused on the bottom line. Their firstborn, Nathan, wasn't just their son. He was their crowning achievement. 5 years older than me, he was a carbon copy of their ambition. He was the golden child, the star quarterback of the family, the one who never dropped the ball. He got the grades, the accolades, the easy, confident smile of someone who has never for a second doubted his place in the world. And then there was me. I wasn't built for their world of closing costs and property lines. My mind worked in textures, colors, and silhouettes. I didn't see a plot of land. I saw the way a woman's coat might billow as she walked across it. My passion, my very soul, was tied up in fashion design, a pursuit so frivolous in their eyes it might as well have been witchcraft. The only person who spoke my language was my grandmother, Clara Hayes. Grandma Clara wasn't just a refuge. She was my entire world. She was this vibrant, unstoppable force, with eyes that saw everything you tried to hide and a laugh that could chase the shadows out of any room. While my parents were drilling Nathan on interest rates, she was sitting with me at her old Singer sewing machine, the gentle hum of it a constant comfort. Her hands, warm and mapped with the fine lines of a long life, would guide mine across a piece of silk. Creativity is its own kind of empire, Alex, she'd whisper, her voice a warm conspiracy just for the two of us. It's built on beauty and heart, not just bricks and mortar. Don't ever let anyone else put a price on it. Then she'd lean in closer, her eyes twinkling. And remember, Grandma always has a way to protect you. I thought she just meant with a hug or a kind word. I had no idea. I remember one Sunday dinner vividly. I was 15. I just won a small local design contest for a jacket I had spent weeks creating. I was buzzing with excitement. Nathan landed the Miller account. My mother announced as she passed the mashed potatoes, her voice glowing with pride. Biggest commercial listing of the quarter. Attaboy, Nate, my father grunted, raising his glass of iced tea. Then, as always, the spotlight swung to me. And what have you been up to, Alex? My mother asked, her tone already laced with the weary expectation of disappointment. I won the Asheville Youth Design Prize, I said, my voice smaller than I wanted it to be. The prize is a mentorship with a local tailor. Nathan let out a short, sharp laugh. It was a sound designed to cut. A mentorship? So you can learn how to hem pants for a living? Fantastic. Now, Nathan, my mother said, but there was no force behind it. She turned to me. That's nice, dear. But don't you think it's time to focus on things that will lead to a real career? Your brother is already building his future. My future, apparently, was a subject for their design, not mine. Later that night, my grandmother called. She must have sensed the defeat in my voice. I saw a picture of the jacket online, she said. It was magnificent, Alex. It had strength. Don't you listen to them. Margaret. Your mother is a good woman, but she is blind to any path that isn't paved with her own ambition. Don't let her blindness dim your light. When Grandma Clara was diagnosed with cancer, it was like the sun began to set on my world. She fought with a grace and strength that awed me, but we lost her just before my 16th birthday. Her loss wasn't just a hole in my life. It was a cataclysm. The one person who saw me, truly saw me, was gone. And with her, the one buffer between me and the full force of my family's expectations disappeared. Nathan, who had always resented my bond with her, moved swiftly to consolidate his power. He became the undisputed center of their universe, and I became a satellite in a distant, irrelevant orbit. When I turned 16, Nathan, who had gotten a brand new convertible for his 16th, magnanimously gave me his old, beat-up sedan. It was presented as a grand gesture of brotherly love. See? He looks out for you, my mother said, beaming. I knew the truth. It was a hand-me-down, another way to mark my status as secondary. I had to work 20 hours a week at a local tailor shop just to pay for the gas and insurance, a fact that was often brought up. It's good for Alex to learn the value of $1, my father would say, while writing a check to cover Nathan's university club fees without a second thought. The college battle was a war I was destined to lose. I had folders full of brochures from Parsons and FIDM, the promised lands of design. My best friend Sophia, who was a year ahead of me and already living my dream at the Rhode Island School of Design, would video call me from her chaotic, inspiring studio. Just apply, Alex, she'd plead, showing me the dress forms and bolts of fabric that were her daily reality. Show them what you can do. Don't let them win. But I was 18, living under their roof and financially dependent. One evening, my mother sat me down and slid a single, glossy brochure for the University of North Carolina's Business School across the dining room table. This is where you're going, she announced. It wasn't a discussion. It was a decree. Nathan did wonderfully there. You'll follow in his footsteps. I fought, but it was like punching water. In the end, I did what I always did. I compromised. The word still tastes like ash in my mouth. I majored in business, a 4-year sentence of studying spreadsheets and marketing funnels that felt like a foreign language. For myself, I minored in design. Those classes were my only oxygen. I kept my job at the tailor shop, using the money to buy my own art supplies and textbooks, which I kept hidden in my dorm room like a dirty secret. After graduation, I fled. I took the first job I could get at a tiny fashion startup in Charlotte. The pay was terrible, the hours were grueling, but I was breathing my own air. I was designing. The lead designer, Elijah Washington, became my unofficial mentor. He was a tough, brilliant man who had fought his way up in an industry that wasn't always kind. He'd lean over my drafting table, squinting at my work. "You got a good eye, kid," he'd grunt one day. "You tell a story. Most of these kids coming out of school, they just copy what they see on Instagram. You got a voice. Don't you ever lose it." His words were a lifeline. I clung to them during the long, lonely nights in my small apartment. I only went home for Thanksgiving and Christmas, and each visit was a masterclass in passive aggression. Nathan, now a rising star at Hayes Realty, would corner me, a smug look on his face. "So, how's the little sewing circle going? Still making enough to pay your rent?" My mother would look at my clothes I had designed and made myself, with a critical eye. "It's a nice hobby, Alex, but look at your brother. He's about to buy his first investment property." For a few years, I managed to keep their world at bay. My little startup was getting some buzz. We were surviving, but the startup world is a brutal one. Our main investor got cold feet and pulled out. The company imploded overnight. One day I had a job, a purpose. The next, I was standing in an empty office with a cardboard box of my belongings. My savings evaporated in 2 months. I was applying for everything, but the market was tight. With rent looming and my bank account nearing zero, I had to face the ultimate humiliation. I had to swallow every jagged shard of my pride and make the call. I remember my hand shaking as I dialed my mother's number. "Mom," I started, my voice strained. I'm in a tough spot. The company went under. I was wondering if I could come home, just for a couple of months, just until I get back on my feet." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, then a muffled sound. She was covering the receiver, but not well enough. I heard her voice, distant but clear. "It's Alex. He lost his job. He wants to come home." And then I heard his voice, Nathan's, low, cold, and laced with a triumphant cruelty that chilled me to the bone. "Let him come home," he said. "He'll see." My mother came back on the line, her voice artificially bright. "Of course, dear. You come on home. We're family, after all." I hung up the phone, a cold dread washing over me. I didn't know what Nathan meant by "he'll see," but I was about to learn that coming home wasn't an act of mercy. It was the beginning of my punishment. Walking back into my childhood home at 29 wasn't a comfort. It was a regression. The air was thick with a history of my failures, and my brother Nathan was the self-appointed warden of my new prison. The first 24 hours were deceptively calm, a strategic silence before the psychological warfare began. On the second day, he sat me down in the formal living room, a room reserved for important guests and, apparently, disciplinary hearings for failed sons. "So, we need to lay down some ground rules," he began, pushing a single, crisply printed sheet of paper across the polished coffee table. It wasn't handwritten. It was typed. He'd put thought into this. I picked it up. It was titled "House Rules for Alex." I felt a hot flush of shame creep up my neck. The list was a masterpiece of petty tyranny. Curfew, 11 p.m. on weeknights, 12 a.m. on weekends. I was 29 years old. Kitchen access is limited after 9 p.m. Clean up immediately after use. Guests are not permitted without 24-hour prior approval from Nathan. Weekly chores, non-negotiable. The list included mowing the lawn, a job they had a service for, weeding the extensive flower beds, washing all family cars, including his convertible, every Saturday, and taking out all trash and recycling. Rent, $500 per month, due on the 1st. No exceptions. "Nathan, this is insane," I said. my voice quiet but shaking. I don't have a job. How am I supposed to pay rent? That sounds like a you problem, he said, leaning back into the plush armchair, the picture of unconcerned authority. There's a now hiring sign at the Starbucks down the road. Maybe you can finally put that business degree to use and learn how to froth milk. Figure it out. My parents were ghosts in their own home. My father would disappear into his study or out into the yard. My mother would busy herself with work, her conversations with me brief and superficial. Their silence was a form of consent. They had handed Nathan the keys to my cage. Life became a series of daily humiliations. Nathan would accidentally leave the real estate section of the newspaper on my bed, with entry-level assistant jobs circled in red ink. He'd critique my clothes, my haircut, the way I loaded the dishwasher. It was a relentless, grinding campaign to erode what little self-esteem I had left. And then there was Vanessa, Nathan's girlfriend. She was his perfect counterpart, a woman whose designer handbags seemed to be filled with sharpened daggers. She'd visit several times a week, and her presence always ratcheted up the tension. She treated me not just as a failure, but as a contamination in their perfect world. One evening, she and Nathan were on the couch, flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. She stopped on a page featuring a flamboyant couture gown. God, can you imagine spending thousands of dollars on something so ridiculous? She said loudly, angling the page so I could see it from the kitchen. She looked over at me, a pitying little smile on her face. No offense, Alex. It just seems like such a fantasy world. It's a good thing you're finally thinking about getting a real job. For your parents' sake. Every word was a carefully placed needle. I spent my days as a phantom in the house, confining myself to my room, the walls of which felt like they were closing in a little more each day. The only escape was my laptop. I poured every ounce of my energy into job applications, sending out my portfolio to anyone and everyone, from high-end brands to small-town boutiques. Each rejection email, and there were many, was another turn of the screw. The breaking point, the moment the Cold War turned hot, came about a month into my sentence. Desperate to prove my worth, to show them I wasn't just a freeloader with a useless hobby, I saw an opportunity. Hayes Realty's online presence was a joke. Their website looked like it was designed in 1998. They had no social media, no virtual tours, nothing to appeal to a modern market. I spent a week working tirelessly. I designed a new, sophisticated website. I researched and outlined a plan for creating stunning virtual tours of their premium listings. I even mocked up a 6-month social media content calendar. I wasn't just playing with crayons. This was a solid business proposal, using my design skills in a practical, commercial way they could understand. I was genuinely proud of it. I thought, this they have to respect. I requested a formal meeting. The three of them, my mother, father, and Nathan, sat opposite me at the dining room table, their faces impassive. I was nervous, but I delivered my pitch with as much confidence as I could muster. I walked them through the designs, the strategy, the projected return on investment. When I finished, there was a long silence. My father cleared his throat and looked at my mother. My mother looked at Nathan. It was Nathan who spoke. He didn't even look at the proposal I'd placed in front of him. He just leaned back in his chair, a slow, condescending smile spreading across his face. Wow, Alex, that's really something. You must have spent a lot of time on this. Hope, foolish and fragile, flickered in my chest. I did. I think it could really. It's adorable, he cut in, the smile turning into a sneer. It's like a school project. How I spent my summer unemployment. But we're running a multimillion-dollar business here, not a high school bake sale. We have professionals for this. But I am a professional, I countered, my voice rising. This is what I do. I'm trying to help. My mother finally spoke, her voice laced with that familiar tone of weary disappointment. Alex, please. We appreciate the effort, truly. But Nathan is right. This is out of your depth. You should be focusing your energy on finding stable employment, not on these distractions. Distractions. All my work, my skill, my attempt to contribute, reduced to a distraction. That's when something inside me, something I had kept locked down for years, finally broke free. A distraction? I said, my voice low and shaking with a sudden white-hot fury. My entire life, my passion has been a distraction to you people. The only thing that matters in this house is what Nathan does, what Nathan wants, what makes Nathan look good. Oh, here we go, Nathan sighed, rolling his eyes. Poor little victim Alex. I'm not a victim, I shot back, standing up. I'm the only one who seems to remember that Grandma Clara thought my distraction was a gift. She was the only person in this family who ever saw me, and you've hated me for it ever since she died. Nathan's face went dark. He stood up, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He got right in my face, his voice a low, venomous hiss. You leave her out of this. You have no idea what you're talking about. I know she believed in me. I yelled, my throat raw. She was a sentimental old fool, he roared, his face inches from mine. An old woman who didn't understand how the world works. And she was wrong about you. You want to know what you are? Alex? You're a leech. A 29-year-old failure who came crawling back here with his tail between his legs. You are nothing. The words struck me with the force of a physical blow. To hear him use her memory as a weapon against me, it was unforgivable. I stared at him, my heart hammering. I looked at my mother, who was watching with a horrified but silent expression. I looked at my father, who was staring down at his hands, abdicating responsibility as he always did. I didn't have any more words. The fight was gone, replaced by a cold, devastating certainty. I backed away from the table, turned, and walked out of the room. I grabbed my wallet and keys from the hook by the door and left, the slam of the screen door echoing behind me. I drove for what felt like hours, the anger and hurt churning in my gut. I ended up in a deserted parking lot, the engine off, the silence ringing in my ears. Couldn't go back. Not tonight. The thought of sleeping under the same roof as him made my skin crawl. My hands trembling, I scrolled through my phone. I had one lifeline, one person who had never made me feel small. I called Elijah. He answered on the second ring, his voice calm and steady. Hey kid, what's up? Elijah, I managed to say, my voice cracking embarrassingly. I'm sorry to do this. I had a massive fight with my family. I'm out of the house. I don't know where to go. Is there any chance? Is your couch available? There was no judgment in his reply, no hesitation, just immediate solid support. My couch isn't fancy, but it's not full of snakes. Get over here. I'll leave the light on. The relief that washed over me was so intense it was painful. I spent that night on his lumpy but blessedly safe sofa. The next morning, determined to start clawing my way out of this hole, I used his old laptop to check my bank account. I needed to know exactly what I had to work with. That's when I saw it. The joint account, the one I shared with Nathan, the one that had my last $850 in it. The balance was zero. I clicked on the transaction history, my blood running cold. A single withdrawal for the full amount had been made the previous evening, right after I'd stormed out of the house. It was processed by the primary account holder, Nathan Hayes. He hadn't just humiliated me. He hadn't just insulted the memory of our grandmother. He had waited until I was at my most vulnerable, and then he had systematically, deliberately stolen every last penny I had to my name. I just sat there, staring at the screen, the full scope of his cruelty finally clear. This wasn't a family dispute. This was a calculated act of destruction. The next 48 hours were a descent. I was running on fumes, emotionally and financially. Elijah was a saint. He acted like having a house guest who was one step away from a complete breakdown was the most normal thing in the world. He'd make an extra cup of coffee in the morning, leave it on the counter for me, and head off to the workshop he now ran. You hangin' in there, kid? He'd ask, and I'd nod, unable to articulate the depth of my despair. His couch was safe, but it wasn't a solution. I was a 29-year-old man sleeping in his former mentor's living room. The shame was a physical weight. I knew I couldn't stay there forever. The thought of being a burden on one of the few people who had ever shown me genuine kindness was unbearable. I had the memory of that one promising interview with Jessica Lynn, but a memory doesn't pay for a security deposit. It doesn't buy groceries. It was a lottery ticket I was waiting to see if I'd won, and I couldn't afford to wait. So, on the second day, I decided I had to do something. Anything. I couldn't just marinate in my own misery. Action, no matter how small, felt like the only antidote to the paralysis of despair. I scraped together the loose change in my pockets and the last few dollars from my wallet. It was enough for a cheap notepad and a couple of decent pens from a dollar store. Then I walked to the Asheville Public Library. The place felt enormous and anonymous. I was grateful for that. I found a corral in a dusty corner on the second floor, a small, scratched-up wooden desk with a hard plastic chair. The air smelled of old paper and neglect. I sat there, surrounded by strangers living their normal lives. Students studying, elderly people reading the newspaper, mothers with their children in the kids section. I felt like a ghost, completely disconnected from their reality. The humiliation was a hot brand on my skin. This was my rock bottom. I took out the fresh notepad. The blank page was intimidating. My entire professional portfolio, years of work, was on a laptop locked inside that house. My sketchbooks, filled with ideas and inspirations, were in my old room, hostages in a war I had already lost. But they couldn't take what was in my head. They couldn't take what was in my hands. So I started to draw. I tried to recreate my best designs from memory. The lines felt clumsy at first, my hand unsteady. The frustration was immense. The library's Wi-Fi was painfully slow, making it impossible to even look up reference images. I felt a surge of rage, wanting to scream, to throw the notepad against the wall. But I took a deep breath, and I kept going. I drew the sharp, asymmetrical lines of a wool coat I was particularly proud of. I sketched the delicate draping of a silk blouse. And then, something new started to emerge. All the anger, the betrayal, the crushing weight of the last few weeks. It started to flow out of me through the pen and onto the page. The designs became bolder, more aggressive. The silhouettes were sharper. There was a story in these new drawings, a story of defiance. For hours, the world outside my little corral disappeared. It was just me, the rhythmic scratch of the pen on the paper, and the ghost of my grandmother's voice in my ear, urging me on. It was a tiny act of creation in the face of so much destruction, and it was the only thing that made me feel human. This, I thought, my hand moving furiously, this you can't take from me. I was so engrossed that I almost ignored the buzz of my phone. I glanced at it, expecting a text from Sophia checking in, or maybe another empty threat from Nathan. But it was an email. The sender was Walsh and Foster Law Firm. My heart did a painful, sickening lurch. I clicked it open, my breath catching in my throat. I was staring at the subject line, the words seeming to mock me from the screen. Urgent. Notification regarding breach of terms of the Clara Hayes Family Trust. My first thought was a blast of pure paranoia. Nathan wasn't content with just throwing me out and stealing my money. Now he was sending his legal pit bulls after me. This had to be a cease and desist. A restraining order. Some formal, terrifying document designed to legally sever me from the family name forever. It felt exactly like his style. Overkill designed to crush, not just to win. My instinct was to slam the laptop shut, to delete the email, to run. But then I looked down at the drawing in my notepad. It was a design for a jacket with a high, protective collar, like armor. Elijah's voice echoed in my head. Don't let them take your fight, too. No, I wasn't going to run. I had to face this. I had to know what new weapon they had fashioned to use against me. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely type, but I found the phone number at the bottom of the email and dialed it from a quiet corner of the library's hallway. I expected to be put on hold, to be treated like a nuisance. A calm, impossibly professional woman's voice answered on the second ring. Walsh and Foster, this is Brenda speaking. How may I help you? Hello, I said, my voice hoarse, barely a whisper. My name is Alex Hayes. I received an email from your office regarding the Clara Hayes Trust. There was a brief pause, the sound of a keyboard clicking. "Ah, yes, Mr. Hayes. We're so glad you called. Mr. Walsh has been trying to reach you. He'd like to schedule an in-person meeting at your earliest convenience to discuss the matter." "Discuss what?" I asked, my stomach twisting. "Am I being sued?" Brenda chuckled, a sound so normal it was jarring. "Oh goodness, no, Mr. Hayes. Quite the opposite, I should think. Mr. Walsh simply needs to discuss the breach of the trust terms and, well, your new position as a result. Are you available to come in tomorrow morning? Say, 10 o'clock. Her words didn't make any sense. My new position? Quite the opposite. It wasn't a threat. It was an appointment, an invitation. It was a complete mystery. A puzzle box dropped into the middle of my nightmare. And for the first time since my key had failed to turn in the lock, a sliver of something other than pure dread worked its way through my defenses. It wasn't hope. It was a fierce, burning curiosity. And that was enough to make me say, "Yes, I'll be there." The next morning, I borrowed a clean, pressed shirt from Elijah, a shirt that felt like a costume for a role I wasn't prepared to play. Walking into the Walsh and Foster law firm was like stepping into another dimension. The air was cool and smelled of lemon polish, old books, and money. A silent receptionist with a headset led me down a long, plushly carpeted hallway to a conference room that overlooked the city. The view of the Blue Ridge Mountains, hazy and majestic in the morning light, should have been calming. It just made me feel small. I sat at one end of a massive, polished mahogany table, my worn messenger bag on the floor beside me like a nervous pet. I felt like a kid who had been called to the principal's office. A few moments later, the door opened and Edward Walsh entered. He was tall and distinguished, probably in his late 60s, with a full head of perfectly combed silver hair and a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He moved with a quiet authority that filled the room. This was a man who was accustomed to being in charge. "Mr. Hayes," he said, his voice a calm, deep baritone. He extended a hand, his grip firm and dry. "Edward Walsh, thank you for coming in. Please have a seat." I gestured to the chair I was already perched on. "Thank you for seeing me," I said, my voice sounding thin. "I have to admit, I'm completely in the dark here. I assume my brother, Nathan Hayes, retained your firm." A very slight, almost imperceptible smile touched Mr. Walsh's lips. "A logical assumption, given the circumstances, but incorrect. I have never met your brother. My client, Mr. Hayes, is your late grandmother, Clara Hayes." He paused. "Or rather, the trust she established in her name. I am the executor." He sat down opposite me and placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the table. He opened it with practiced ease. "I was one of your grandmother's first clients many years ago," he said, his professional demeanor softening for a moment. "She was a remarkable woman, one of the sharpest and most intuitive people I have ever had the pleasure of representing. She once told me, 'Edward, I trust people who are good with numbers, but I trust my heart more. And my heart tells me my grandson will need a fortress one day.'" It seems her intuition was, as usual, correct. My throat felt thick. "Fortress." "Mr. Walsh," I said, my voice strained. "What is this about?" The email mentioned a breach. "Indeed," he said, his tone becoming more formal again. "Your grandmother was not only a woman of heart, she was a woman of foresight. 15 years ago, she established the Clara Hayes Family Trust. She placed her most significant assets into this trust, including her investment portfolio and the deed to her primary residence, the house on Kenilworth Road." My heart started a slow, heavy drumbeat against my ribs. "I don't understand," I said. "That's my parents' house. They inherited it." "No," Mr. Walsh stated, his gaze steady and direct. "They did not. That is a common misconception, one your grandmother, it seems, anticipated and allowed. Legally, since the moment of her passing, the house has belonged entirely to the trust. Your parents were granted what is known as lifetime residency rights. They were, in effect, long-term tenants, caretakers, not owners." He turned a page in the portfolio, revealing a document filled with dense, numbered paragraphs. The terms of this residency were very specific, and your grandmother, being the protector she was, included a rather unique fail-safe clause. Clause 7b. He slid the document across the table. I stared at the page, the legalese swimming before my eyes. He pointed to a highlighted section. In the event, he read aloud, that the designated residential caretakers, or any of their legal dependents, take any action to willfully bar, expel, deny access to, or otherwise remove the primary beneficiary from the premises, all residency rights granted herein shall be immediately and irrevocably terminated. The clause is quite clear. My mind was spinning, trying to catch up. Primary beneficiary. Mr. Walsh looked at me, a glimmer of satisfaction in his eyes. That would be you, Alex. The air left my lungs in a rush. Me. The words on the page suddenly snapped into focus. Deny access. Expel. Remove. When your brother changed the locks on the house and sent you a text message telling you not to return, Mr. Walsh continued, he wasn't just being cruel. He was, from a legal standpoint, committing a catastrophic error. He triggered Clause 7b. He breached the trust. So, what does that mean? I whispered. It means your parents' right to live in that house is terminated, he said simply. But it's more significant than that. Your grandmother structured the trust with a second key provision. Upon a material breach of the kind we have just witnessed, or upon your 30th birthday, whichever came first, the trust is instructed to be dissolved and its assets transferred. He let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final, earth-shattering blow. The house on Kenilworth Road, Alex, is now legally yours. The deed will be transferred into your name, free and clear, as will the entire remaining contents of the Clara Hayes Trust, which, after 15 years of careful management, amounts to a very substantial investment portfolio. He turned the portfolio around so I could see a summary statement. The number at the bottom made me feel dizzy. It was an amount of money I couldn't even properly comprehend. Your grandmother's instructions were explicit, Mr. Walsh said softly. This was to ensure you would have the complete and total freedom to pursue your life and your art, without being subject to financial pressure or emotional manipulation from anyone. It was her final gift to you, her fortress. I stared at the papers, at the impossible numbers, at the legal jargon that spelled out a reality I had never dreamed of. I saw my grandmother's elegant, looping signature at the bottom of a page, and a wave of grief and gratitude so powerful it almost knocked me out of my chair washed over me. She had known. All those years ago, she had seen the storm coming and had built me an ark. The lockout, the text message, the theft, they weren't my defeat. They were the keys that had just unlocked my entire future. I looked up at Mr. Walsh, my mind a chaotic symphony of shock, rage, and a profound, aching love for the woman who had orchestrated this from beyond the grave. What do I do now? I asked, my voice barely audible. Mr. Walsh closed the portfolio and pushed it gently towards my side of the table. His expression was serious, a mentor preparing his student for the final test. Now, Alex, he said, you have a choice to make. Your grandmother provided you with the power. Whether or not you have the courage to claim it, that is entirely up to you. I walked out of that law firm holding a simple manila folder. Felt heavier than a suitcase full of bricks. Inside was a copy of the trust, a notarized letter from Mr. Walsh summarizing my legal position, and a brand new single key. A key to my front door. The fear was still there. A cold, coiling snake in my gut. For my entire life, I had been programmed to avoid confrontation with my family, to absorb their disapproval, to make myself smaller to avoid their wrath. But as I drove away from the lawyer's office, a new feeling began to burn through the fear. A cold, hard anger. It wasn't the hot, helpless rage I'd felt before. This was different. It was focused. It was the anger of someone who had finally been handed a sword after a lifetime of being told to carry a shield. I didn't drive back to Elijah's. I drove straight to Kenilworth Road. I parked on the street, not in the driveway. I wanted them to see me arrive. I walked up the familiar stone path, my steps deliberate and steady. I didn't knock. I didn't ring the bell. I slid the new key into the lock. It turned with a quiet, decisive click that was louder to me than a gunshot. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The scene was one of perfect domestic tranquility. The television was murmuring in the living room. My father was dozing in his big leather armchair. My mother was on the sofa, scrolling through something on her tablet. And my brother, Nathan, the king of this castle, was pacing in front of the fireplace, phone pressed to his ear, closing some deal, making some conquest. The sound of the front door closing broke the spell. 3 heads snapped in my direction. Nathan's face, a moment before a mask of focused ambition, contorted into a snarl of disbelief and fury. "What the hell are you doing here?" he barked, ending his call abruptly. "I told you not to come back. How did you get in?" My mother shot to her feet, her tablet clattering onto the couch cushions. Her face was pale. "Alex, you can't be here. You need to leave. Right now." I took a few steps further into the room, onto the Persian rug that had been there my whole life. "My rug. Actually," I said, my voice calm and even, a stark contrast to the hammering in my chest. "I'm the only one here who has an undeniable right to be." Nathan took a menacing step forward. "What did you say? Are you on something? I'll call the cops. I will have you arrested for trespassing." "Go ahead," I said, meeting his furious gaze without flinching. "I'd love to explain the situation to them. I'm sure they'll be very interested in the terms of the Clara Hayes Family Trust." The name hit the room like a grenade. My mother gasped. Nathan froze mid-step, the color draining from his face. My father, now fully awake, sat bolt upright in his chair. You don't know what you're talking about," Nathan stammered, the bully's bluster starting to crack. "Oh, but I do," I said, allowing myself a small, cold smile. "I spent my morning with Edward Walsh. I'm sure you know the name. He's a very thorough man. He explained everything. He explained how this house, since the day Grandma died, has belonged to a trust. He explained how you were all just tenants." "That's a lie," my mother shrieked, finding her voice. "This is our house. We worked our whole lives." "You lived here," I corrected her, my voice cutting through her hysteria, "at the discretion of the trust, a discretion you violated." Mr. Walsh was very clear on that point. He called it a material breach, a funny legal term for changing the locks on the primary beneficiary and stealing his money. I watched the full understanding dawn on their faces. It was a slow, agonizing, and beautiful thing to witness. The shock, the denial, the dawning horror. "So," I continued, taking control of the room, "we're going to establish some new house rules." "My rules?" I looked directly at Nathan. "Rule number 1. You no longer have any authority here. You are a guest in my house." "Your house?" he sputtered, his voice cracking. "You think you can just come in here?" "Yes," I said simply. "I can. And I am." I turned to my mother. "You were so worried about me finding a real career, Mom. Well, I have one now. It's called being your landlord. And frankly, you haven't been a very good tenant." She stared at me, her mouth opening and closing but no sound coming out. Finally, I looked at my father, who looked small and utterly defeated in his big chair. "And you, Dad, you stood by. For years, you just stood by and let this happen. You let him poison this family because you were too weak to stand up to him. Alex, son, it's more complicated than that," he began, his voice pleading. "No," I said, holding up a hand. "It's not. It's very simple. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine." I let the silence stretch, savoring the profound shift in power. They were waiting for me to yell, to scream, to break down. I did none of those things. "I have the legal right to have you removed from this property tonight," I said, my voice quiet and measured. "But I won't do that. Unlike you, I have some decency." I looked at each of them in turn, my gaze hard as iron. "You have 30 days. Pack your things. Find a new place to live. At the end of 30 days, I am changing the locks, and your keys will no longer work. Am I understood?" Nathan looked like he was going to explode. He opened his mouth, a torrent of insults and threats ready to pour out. But he must have seen something new in my eyes, something that wasn't there before. He closed it again. There was nothing more to say. My declaration was made. My independence was claimed. I turned my back on them, walked to the front door, and stepped out into the crisp afternoon air. I pulled the heavy oak door shut behind me, not with a slam, but with a soft, final click. It was the sound of a cage opening. It was the sound of me finally being free. The month that followed was a masterclass in controlled chaos. I didn't set foot in the house again. I didn't need to. I let them stew in the consequences of their own actions. I stayed with Elijah, who refused to take a dime from me, instead declaring his couch a temporary artist's residency. My new life began not in the grand house on Kenilworth Road, but in his small, cluttered, and wonderfully supportive apartment. The first official act of my new life was to call Jessica Lynn. I was terrified she'd have moved on, that my family emergency would sound like a flimsy excuse. "Alex, good to hear from you," she said, her voice warm and professional. "I was hoping you'd call. Is everything all right?" "It is now," I said, the truth of that statement hitting me with surprising force. "I'm still very interested in the position, if it's still available." "The position is yours if you want it," she said simply. "I trust my gut, and my gut told me you were the right choice. When can you start?" I started the following Monday. Walking into that design firm was like breathing for the first time after being held underwater. I was surrounded by creative energy, by people who spoke my language. I was given projects and responsibilities, and I excelled. My ideas weren't distractions. They were assets. For the first time in my professional life, I felt seen and valued. Meanwhile, the predictable barrage from my family began. My mother left a series of tearful, rambling voicemails that swung wildly between, "How could you do this to your own mother?" and, "We miss you, we love you, please just call us." They were performances, and I was no longer an audience. Nathan's approach was less subtle. He sent a volley of texts, starting with legal threats. "My lawyer will eat you alive," which quickly petered out when his lawyer presumably told him he didn't have a leg to stand on. Then they devolved into pathetic, self-serving apologies. "Look, I was stressed. I went too far. We can talk about this." My father was the most succinct. A single text, sent 3 days after the confrontation. "Alex, we need to talk. Please." I deleted them all. Every message, every voicemail. It was a digital cleansing. I was creating a firewall around my new life. On the 31st day, a gray and overcast morning, I drove back to the house. As I pulled up, a large moving truck was rumbling down the street, away from the property. The house stood empty, silent, waiting. I walked through the rooms. They were hollowed out, echoing with the ghosts of their furniture. They had left the place clean, but it felt sterile, devoid of any warmth. It didn't feel like home yet. It just felt empty. So I began to fill it. The first thing I did was hire a crew to repaint the entire interior. The oppressive beige and taupe my mother favored were replaced with clean, gallery white walls. I tore out the heavy, dark drapes and let the natural light flood in. I ripped up the thick, wall-to-wall carpeting and had the original oak floors, hidden for decades, sanded and refinished to a warm golden sheen. My old bedroom, the room where I had felt so trapped, was my primary project. I had it gutted. I installed huge, custom-built drafting tables, floor-to-ceiling shelves for bolts of fabric and books, and a state-of-the-art Juki industrial sewing machine. I turned the site of my adolescent confinement into a professional, light-filled studio. It was more than a renovation. It was a reclamation. About 2 months after I had moved in, my phone rang. It was my father. I don't know why, but this time I answered. "Alex," he said, his voice sounding thin and reedy, stripped of its old, easy authority. I know you don't want to talk to us. I understand. But would you meet me? For a coffee. Not at the house. Somewhere public. Please." There was a desperation in his voice that was new. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We met at a small, neutral cafe downtown. He looked older than I had ever seen him and smaller. He had lost the protective shell of his grand house and his powerful wife, and what was left seemed fragile. He stirred his coffee for a long time before speaking. "Your mother and I are staying with her sister in Hendersonville," he said, not looking at me. "It's temporary." He paused. "Nathan got an apartment across town. Vanessa left him." That was a small, bitter piece of news I hadn't expected. "Dad, why did you want to meet?" I asked, wanting to get to the point. He finally raised his eyes to meet mine. They were filled with a deep, weary shame. "I need you to know the real reason," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Why we let Nathan have so much power. It's not what you think." I waited, saying nothing. "It wasn't just that we favored him," he choked out. 5 years ago, Hayes Realty almost went under. The market turned, we'd over-leveraged on a commercial development, and we were weeks away from bankruptcy. I was staring down the barrel of losing everything your mother and I had ever built. He took a shaky sip of his coffee. "In a moment of panic, I did something stupid, illegal. I moved funds from a client's escrow account to cover a margin call. I told myself I'd replace it before anyone noticed. It was a temporary, desperate move to save the company." He stared down at the table. "But Nathan found out. He was working late, saw some paperwork on my desk he shouldn't have seen. He understood it instantly. He had proof. Enough to send me to prison, to get my license revoked, to destroy your mother's reputation forever." The final, ugly puzzle piece slid into place. It all made a sick kind of sense. Nathan's smugness. My parents' terrified acquiescence. It wasn't just favoritism. It was a hostage situation, and I had been the collateral damage. "He held it over us," my father continued, his voice cracking. "He didn't ask for money. He asked for control. He said he'd keep quiet as long as we acknowledged his position. As long as everyone knew he was the smart one, the successful son, the one in charge. We were trapped, Alex. I was so scared of losing everything. I let him take over our lives. I let him hurt you." He looked at me, his eyes pleading for an absolution I could not give. I listened to his whole confession, and the anger I expected to feel just wasn't there. It had been replaced by a quiet, sad finality. They weren't powerful figures who had wronged me. They were weak people who had made terrible choices and then sacrificed me to avoid the consequences. I stood up from the table. "Was it worth it?" I asked quietly. He didn't have an answer. "It never occurred to you to just tell me the truth?" I asked. He just shook his head, looking defeated. "I was a coward." "Yes," I said. "You were." I placed a $10 bill on the table to cover our coffees. "I can't fix your past, Dad," I said, my voice devoid of malice, just full of a sad certainty. "I can only build my future." I turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving him there with his coffee and his cowardice. The last toxic chain connecting me to their world had just rusted away. I was finally completely on my own, and it felt incredible. It's been a year now, a full year of my new life. The house on Kenilworth Road is no longer a silent, empty building. It's a home, my home. The walls are filled with my art, my books, and the sounds of my own music. The ghost of my family's disapproval has been thoroughly exorcised, replaced by the warm, grounding presence of my own peace. My work at the design firm is going incredibly well. Jessica Lynn turned out to be not just a great boss, but a wonderful mentor. She champions my work, pushes my creativity, and celebrates my successes. But the real heart of my life happens in my studio, the room that used to be my prison. It's there, surrounded by bolts of silk and linen, that my own line, funded by my grandmother's unwavering faith, is taking shape. It's a collection about resilience, about finding beauty in the broken places. The other day, I was working late on a new design, the moonlight streaming through the big windows. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Elijah with a link to a prominent fashion blog. The headline read, "The One to Watch, Alex Hayes and the Rise of Soulful Design." He just texted a single word, "Told ya." I laughed, a real, uncomplicated laugh. My real family, the one I had chosen, made up of people like Elijah and Sophia, was thriving right alongside me. I walked over to the window and looked out at the quiet, sleeping street. A few houses down, a light was on. I thought about what home really meant. For so long, I thought it was a place I had to earn my way into, a club I wasn't good enough to join. I was so desperate for a key to a door that, it turned out, was never meant for me. The truth is, home isn't something you're given, and it isn't something you can be locked out of. It's something you build. It's not four walls and a roof. It's the safety to be unapologetically yourself. It's the freedom to pour your heart into your work. It's the community of people who don't just tolerate you, but who celebrate you. My grandmother, in her infinite wisdom, understood that. She didn't just leave me a house. She knew that real estate was just a foundation. She left me the tools, the resources, and the opportunity to build a life of my own design upon it. She gave me the key, but it was up to me to have the courage to turn the lock and build what was on the other side. And as I stand here now, in my studio, in my home, surrounded by my life's work, I finally understand. I am not just a survivor of my family's story. I am the architect of my own. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it resonated with you in some way. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to fight to be seen for who you really are? Share your story in the comments below. I read them all. And don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss what's next.